Hey, thanks for tuning in. In this video, I'm going to talk about advantages to living in captivity. Much of Israel does not live in the land of Canaan today, and some might describe this as living in captivity. Now, this phrase of living in captivity may not be entirely correct because we're not typically in actual bondage or slavery. But that being said, most of us are not in the land, and we are not in the society that is keeping the Torah. And we might consider how good it would be being taken out of captivity, living in a Torah-keeping nation, with the blessings of obedience, and with Yahuwah being our Elohim, and us being His people. And indeed, that would be good. But I also want us to consider a more detailed picture of this, because living in a Torah-keeping nation comes with challenges and a way of living that many of us might be inclined against. A lot of us find secondary gains through being in captivity, or advantages through living in captivity. Right now, living in the midst of a non-observant society and being around a different culture and having a different way of thinking means that for some of us, we may not entirely be on board with going to another culture, another way of thinking, even if that is the way of the commands. While there are a number of examples for this, there are three that I want to point out. One is the eviction of the inhabitants of the land and the concern for the eyes of the nations. We can easily see how this played out with the way Israel first approached the land, and even with the modern state of Israel in the land. When Israel was in the wilderness and first approached Canaan, they were afraid of going to war, and they refused to do it because they were worried that Canaan was stronger than them and that they would take their women and children for loot. And even after they began to fight, they did not want to evict all of the inhabitants of the land, and they made covenants with the inhabitants of the land. And concerning the modern state of Israel, they even withdrew from parts of the land that they had taken and ended up ceding control of it, even though it was part of the allotment that was supposed to be given to them. They refused to evict the inhabitants. There is no doubt that following the commands for occupying Canaan today would result in tremendous international outcry and subsequently the fear of a massive war. And a lot of people would take living in captivity over that. Another example is the tent of meeting and the sacrifices. Partially because of, once again, the culture that many of us were raised in, a lot of people are bothered by the idea of animal sacrifices, even though fundamentally they're not different from butchering for food. It's not something that most people are used to or around very much now, and as a result, some of us are strongly against it. Some would rather just consider the tent of meeting to be an irrelevant set of commands and not really think about it too much today, let alone see it or contribute to it. So if the tent of meeting was brought back and the commands for it were being followed, this would mean regular animal sacrifice. And finally, and probably one of the more difficult ones for many of us, is the matter of judgment and punishment in the Torah-keeping nation. How many of us have witnessed other Torah keepers rationalize breaking the Shabbat? Maybe saying they had no choice but to do work on the Shabbat. Right now, most of us are not inclined to follow Leviticus 19:17. and not inclined to just speak against or try to convince a person to not break the Shabbat once they have set about doing it. And I've even heard that it's an unseemly thing to do, or even wrong, to try to follow that command of Leviticus 19:17. And even if we don't believe that following that command is wrong, we may not want to risk being perceived a certain way if we did it. And we might rather believe that everyone is just sorting out their own salvation and observance, or let's not rock the boat too much. And yet, Leviticus 19:17 is a command that we could seek to obey today. Considering that, how can we even imagine bringing someone, like someone that was caught breaking the Shabbat, bringing that person before the judges in the land? Many people would rather hide their eyes and not follow those commands. Living in the land does not mean that everything is easy, and it does not fit with the way that everyone might think or be inclined to live right now. We should consider living in the land, living in an observant society, Him being our Elohim, us being His people, in a more thorough way, partially because of our background, partially because of the inclination of our heart. It is not without its challenges, and it is not without potential consequences. There's probably a reason why Orthodox Judaism and some other groups will sometimes speak of waiting for the Messiah to resolve everything for us, believing that everything will just suddenly change. In the process, we wouldn't have to change. We wouldn't have to change our heart, or change ourselves, or change our environment. Yet, everything is just totally resolved. Obviously, that belief has its appeal to it. But difficulty may be ahead of us, and we should expect to be tested in that. We need to be seeking His commands and returning to His ways. Even if the Torah society has not been established yet, there certainly is a point in seeking to do what is good and right in His sight today. We want to be seeking His righteousness and seeking His mercy, even in our current situation. We want to start shifting our mindset and recognizing these secondary gains that we may have found with living in captivity, and start considering what it would take for us in the future to arrive at a society that is compatible with what He wants. Thanks for watching, and remember the commands. Shalom.